The desert was not empty. It only pretended to be. From a distance, the Arizona territory stretched out in a haze of heat and dust flat, colorless and barren to anyone who didn't know better. The pale sky seemed to press down on the world, until even the rocks looked tired of holding themselves up. But to the people who had walked this land for generations, the desert was a living thing, breathing slow, hiding its teeth in plain sight beyond the town limits. Wind pushed against sandstone cliffs, slipping into hidden gullies where pools of rainwater clung stubbornly to life. Coyotes called to one another in the cool hours before dawn. Mesquite trees held the scent of sap and shadow. And far off, where the mesas rose like the backs of sleeping giants, the ground trembled with the faint sound of hooves. The town of San Madrigal sat in the middle of it all, a knot of humanity trying to pretend it was more important than the land that surrounded it. A single street ran through the center hard-packed dirt, flanked by false-fronted buildings, each one leaning just a little more than the year before. There was the general store, the saloon with its cracked batwing doors, the sheriff's office, with its one cell, and a church whose bell could be heard for miles. On Sundays, the bell told the world that San Madrigal was civilized. The rest of the week, it was quieter, but not kinder. It was the kind of place where people minded each other's business in whispers but kept their eyes down in public. The desert demanded toughness, and the townsfolk believed that meant cruelty. Mercy was a weakness, they said, and weakness got you killed. Men carried that belief in the set of their shoulders. Women carried it in the silence between their words. Children learned it before they could write their names. The wind here had a way of listening. It carried secrets: who was cheating at cards, who hadn't paid their debts, who was seen slipping from a back door after dark. But it also carried the things no one wanted to speak aloud, like the cries from behind closed doors. Upon this particular morning, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the sun had risen with a grudge. The first rays of light had barely crested the hills when a figure moved through the empty street, a man wrapped in a blanket-striped serape, his wide-brimmed hat tilted low. He did not belong to the town. He was only passing through, yet he slowed when he heard a sound that did not belong either. It was the sound of fists against flesh. It came from a low adobe house near the edge of town, where a thin ribbon of smoke curled from a chimney. The town would later claim it had heard nothing, or, if pressed, it would insist it wasn't its business. But the truth was that in San Madrigal, a man beating his wife was less scandal than a man refusing to pay his bar tab. Inside the house, Maria's world was small: a dirt floor, a wooden table, 5 handmade cradles lined against the wall like silent witnesses. Each cradle belonged to a daughter. That was her crime. She had given birth 5 times, and 5 times she had failed to produce the son her husband demanded. Her husband was not a cruel man by his own measure. He worked the land, provided food, and went to church when he could. But he believed the worth of a woman was in the sons she bore, and Maria had not borne a single one. This morning his disappointment had spilled into rage, and his rage into blows. The desert outside remained still. A tumbleweed rolled lazily across the street as if nothing inside the adobe walls mattered. The sound of each strike disappeared into the open air, swallowed by the silence of the land. Up on the distant ridge, something else listened. From his vantage point atop a sandstone ledge, a man much larger than most broad-shouldered, towering, skin sun-browned and lined, stood perfectly still. His black hair was tied back with a strip of leather, and a single eagle feather trembled in the morning breeze. To the townsfolk, if they had seen him, he would have been just another Apache warrior, dangerous, unpredictable, and unwelcome. But his name was Taza, and to his people he was a protector, a shadow that moved between the mesas and the white man's roads. He had been following the wind for days, letting it tell him where to go. This morning it had brought him here, and now it told him of a woman's cries in a language older than words. He did not yet know her name or her face, but the desert had a way of guiding him toward those in need. San Madrigal would remember this day differently. Some would say the giant came for revenge. Others would claim he came to steal. The truth began here, in the silence before he moved, when the desert watched. The wind whispered, and the first shadow fell across the town. Maria had learned long ago that the sound of footsteps told you more than the words that followed them. This morning, her husband's boots struck the dirt floor with the heaviness of a storm, rolling in slow at first. Then, building dots, she had been at the table, rolling out dough for tortillas, the sleeves of her faded dress pushed up to the elbows. A pot of beans simmered nearby, scenting the air with cumin and smoke. Outside, the pale sun had barely touched the rooftops. Inside, the day had already turned hostile. 5 small heads were still tucked under blankets in the corner, the girls, breathing softly in the fragile peace of sleep. Maria's oldest, Sophia, just 7, had stirred when the door opened. She had met her mother's eyes read the warning there, and pulled the covers up to her chin. Her husband didn't speak at first. He stood in the doorway, dust clinging to the knees of his trousers, jaw working as though chewing words too bitter to swallow. Then he asked the question he had asked 100 times in 100 ways. Why can't you give me a son? The first time he'd asked it, years ago, there had been genuine confusion in his voice. The second time, there had been disappointment. Now, on the 5th daughter, it carried accusation. And in accusation, there was always the shadow of blame. Maria, as always, said nothing. The answer would not change. She did not choose the children God gave her. But she knew that saying so, reminding him of God, would only make things worse. "You've made me a laughingstock," he said, stepping forward. "A man without a son. What good is a man without a son? What good is a wife who can't give him one?" The first blow came quick, the back of his hand catching her across the cheek. Her body twisted with the impact, the dough falling from her hands. The second blow followed before she'd righted herself, this time from his fist. Somewhere behind her, one of the girls whimpered. Maria's mind pulled away from the moment, the way it always did. She thought of the acacia trees near the river, the way their branches swayed against the blue sky. She thought of her grandmother's hands, wrinkled and warm, shelling beans in the courtyard of the old house in Sonora. She thought of the sea. She hadn't seen since she was a child the sound of gulls and waves. Anything but here. But her body remained, taking each strike as if it were part of the day's work. Outside, no one came. No one ever did. In San Madrigal, a man's home was his castle, and what happened inside it was his business. The neighbors might hear the shouts, might even hear the dull thud of a body against a wall, but they would only shake their heads and murmur, "Oversight, a poor thing," before turning away. Her husband grabbed her by the arm, forcing her to look at him. His breath smelled of whiskey, though it was still early. "You've got 5 girls," he said, his lip curling. 5 useless mouths, and not a single son to carry my name." He shoved her hard enough that her shoulder struck the adobe wall. Her vision blurred at the edges. She could hear the pot on the stove beginning to boil over, the lid rattling with sharp metallic urgency. In the corner, little Sophia slipped from her blanket, crossing the room to put herself between her father and her mother. "Papa," she began, but he barked at her to go back, his voice cracking like a whip. The girl froze, then obeyed. Maria touched her swollen cheek, feeling the heat of the bruise already forming. She wanted to take her daughters and run. She had thought of it many times, usually in the quiet moments of the night when her husband snored and the moon lit the floor through the window. But where would she go? The desert stretched for miles in every direction. No money, No horse. No safe road for a woman with 5 girls. The air inside the house thickened, heavy with the smell of scorched beans and the unspoken truth. She could endure this, or she could die in it. Those felt like the only choices. Her husband turned away, muttering curses as he stepped toward the door. Maria slumped against the wall, one hand bracing herself, the other touching the side of her head where the ache throbbed in time with her heartbeat. And then, so soft at first she thought she imagined it, she felt a shift in the air. The faintest breeze moved through the open doorway, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant mesquite. Alongside it came a shadow, long and dark, falling across the threshold. She lifted her eyes. There, filling the doorway as if the house had been built, too small for him, stood a man unlike any she had seen. His shoulders were broad enough to block the morning light. His hair was bound back, his face marked by both age and strength, and in his hand he held a staff carved with patterns she didn't know. He did not speak yet. He only looked at her, then at the man who had struck her. And in that moment, Maria felt something she had not felt in years, something that was not fear. It was the first flicker of rescue. The wind had a voice that morning. It didn't howl or sing, it murmured, like someone telling a secret you could only half hear. Taza had learned long ago to listen to such murmurs. The desert spoke in its own way, through the cry of a raven, circling overhead, through the pattern of dust devils skittering across the flats, through the way the air cooled before dawn. To men who ignored it, the land was just emptiness. To him, it was a living map guiding him where he needed to be. Had not meant to come to San Madrigal. His path had been carrying him west toward a canyon where his people kept a hidden store of grain and dried meat. But the wind had shifted in the night, bringing with it something sharp, something that was not the scent of rain or coyote or sage. It was the scent of anger. He had followed it at a distance, moving silently along the ridge above the town. From up there, the buildings looked like children's toys scattered in the dust, each one casting a long, brittle shadow in the morning light. The people below were small and hurried, heads bent against the wind as though afraid to meet its gaze. The murmur had led him to the low adobe house at the town's edge. He watched the man leave it broad in the shoulders, but with the slouched gait of someone who thought himself bigger than he was. The man spat into the dust, muttered something under his breath, and stalked off toward the saloon. Taza single quotes S eyes shifted back to the doorway. Maria stood there, framed by shadow, one hand still braced against the wall. Even from this distance, he could see the swelling along her cheekbone, the redness in her eyes that came not from tears alone but from humiliation, something he recognized too well. He had seen this before. The white men's towns were full of women like her, bound to men who treated them as property, measured their worth in chores done and sons born. And in the border villages, where Mexicans tried to survive between two worlds, it was not much different. The wind curled around Taza's face, carrying voices from the street below. "They say she's cursed," one woman whispered to another as they passed. 5 girls. Not a single boy. She should be grateful he hasn't thrown her out. Grateful. Taza's jaw tightened. He had no patience for that kind of talk, gratitude for cruelty, acceptance of chains. In his own people's law, a woman was a voice in the council, a keeper of stories and life. To strike her was to strike the tribe's future. He turned away from the ridge, making his way down a narrow goat path to the edge of the town. No one noticed him at first. They were too busy avoiding each other's eyes. When someone did see him, they stepped back quickly, crossing to the other side of the street. In the territory, an Apache was a story mothers told their children to. Make them behave. Eat your food or the Apache will come for you. Obey your father or the Apache will take you away. Good. Let them fear. Fear made them keep their distance. The closer he came to Maria's house, the louder the wind's murmur grew. It was not a sound anyone else would have noticed, but to him it was as clear as a voice. This one. Now he stepped into the doorway without asking. The smell inside was of burnt beans and dust, undercut by the faint tang of blood. The 5 girls huddled in the corner, watching him with eyes as wide as a deer's. Maria did not flinch, though her hand dropped instinctively to the hem of her skirt as if to shield herself. They stared at each other for a long moment, measuring something neither could name. "I am Taza," he said finally, his voice deep and low. Maria's lips parted, but no sound came. She was still breathing quickly, her chest rising and falling like a trapped bird's. Behind him, someone's voice called from down the street. "Apache." It was half alarm, half challenge. He ignored it. Taza took one step closer, then another, until he stood within arm's reach. He could see the bruise on her cheek in the thin light from the doorway. He could see, too, the defiance in the way she held her chin despite the pain. He didn't ask her if she wanted to leave. He didn't ask if she had somewhere to go. Those were the wrong questions. "You're coming with me," he said. Not as a demand, not as a threat, but as a fact. The wind pushed through the doorway then, lifting the edge of his hair and carrying the words deeper into the house, into the ears of the children, into the corners of Maria's mind where hope had long been gathering dust. Outside, the whispers began to spread through the street, carried by the same wind. The giant Apache took her, just walked in and took her, but the desert knew the truth. He was not taking her. He was returning her to herself. The street outside Maria's house was starting to wake up, and the waking came with noise. Boots on boards, the creak of leather gun belts, the low murmur of men who had stopped whatever they were doing to watch a scene they would later retell over whiskey, each adding a little more bravado to their version. Taza stepped into the sunlight, Maria still inside behind him. He had not raised his voice, had not drawn a weapon, and yet the space around him had cleared as if he were fire in a dry field. A man in a tan coat, one of the ranch hands from the north end, spat in the dust and called out, "You got no right here, Apache." His voice was loud enough to carry, but there was an edge to it that said he didn't want to be the one to get closer. From farther down the street, the saloon doors swung open and Maria's husband emerged, a half-empty bottle in hand. He squinted into the sun, trying to make sense of the tall figure in front of his house. "What's this?" he barked, stumbling forward. "You're trespassing." Taza didn't look at him right away. He turned his head toward the house and spoke in a tone that carried no hesitation. "Bring your daughters," he told Maria. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Leaving meant leaving everything, the only roof they had, the little she owned, the tiny bit of protection the town might give if things got worse. But staying meant the next beating, and the one after that, until there was nothing left of her but bruises and obedience. She moved, one by one. The girls came to her side, still barefoot, clutching blankets. The townsfolk watched, whispers rustling like dry grass. Maria's husband's face turned red. "She's not going anywhere with you." Taza faced him now, and the shift in the air was immediate. The Apache stood a head taller, his shadow stretching across the dirt until it almost touched the man's boots. His voice was quiet, but the quiet was worse than a shout. "She's already going." Maria's husband gripped the bottle tighter, knuckles white. "You think you can just take her? This is my wife. My property." The word property made Taza's jaw tighten. "You have beaten her," he said, his voice carrying so that all could hear. 5 times, 10 times, maybe more, and the town watched. "That makes you no man." The murmurs in the crowd sharpened, some in agreement, some in anger at the boldness. Maria's husband took a step forward, and the bottle tilted like a club. But Taza didn't step back. In one smooth motion, he reached out, plucked the bottle from the man's hand, and tossed it into the dirt where it shattered, spilling whiskey into the dust. "You're done," Taza said, the ranch hand in the tan. Coat shifted uncomfortably. "Now hold on," he said, glancing around at the other men. "Ain't nobody saying a man can't sort his own household." But the words faltered under the weight of Taza's stare. He stepped aside just enough for Maria and her daughters to pass. She kept her head high, though her hands trembled against the youngest girl's shoulders. The crowd parted for them in uneasy silence. "You take her. You make yourself an enemy of this town," Maria's husband shouted after them. "We'll come for her." Taza turned back once more, the morning sun catching the carved designs on the staff in his hand. "Then come," he said, doubt there was no challenge in his voice, no boast, only certainty, as if the desert itself had already decided the outcome. He walked on, Maria and her daughters following in his shadow. The wind moved with them, sending little spirals of dust across the ground. Behind them, San Madrigal began to breathe again, though it was the shallow, unsettled breathing of people who had just seen something they could not undo. On the ridge above town, the mesas loomed like watchmen, and the sky stretched wide and empty. To the townsfolk, the scene would become a story of theft, of Apache audacity. To Maria, it was the first step out of a cage. The reckoning wasn't over. It had just begun. The desert road beyond San Madrigal was nothing more than a thin line of packed dirt winding into the open land. To Maria, it felt less like a road and more like a thread, fragile, easily broken, leading into a vast unknown. She walked with her daughters close, their small hands clutching her skirt, their bare feet kicking up soft clouds of dust. The town was already fading behind them, its false front buildings shrinking against the horizon. The air here was cleaner, free of the stale smell of whiskey and wood smoke, but it carried a sharpness too, like standing at the edge of something that could swallow you whole. Taza moved ahead of them at an unhurried pace, his long stride steady as though the miles meant nothing. He didn't look back often, but when he did, his eyes scanned the horizon rather than her face. It wasn't indifference, it was watchfulness, the kind that comes from expecting trouble to follow. Maria's breath was still uneven, not from the walk, but from the speed of it all. She had left without a single possession. No shawl, no coins, not even the pot she had cooked from since her wedding day. She felt the weight of absence pressing against her ribs. After an hour, when the last hint of San Madrigal had disappeared behind a low rise, Taza stopped. He planted the carved staff in the dirt and turned toward her. "You're coming with me," he said again, his voice deep and steady. This time, it was not an announcement but a reassurance, as though to remind her she was not just running from something, but towards something else. Maria swallowed. "And if I don't?" He studied her a moment. "Then you keep walking, wherever you choose, but you cannot go back. That door is closed." She thought of her husband's face, red with drink, twisted with rage. She thought of the bruises, the long silences, the way her girls had learned to make themselves small in every room. And she knew he was right. That door wasn't just closed, it had been locked from the other side for years. "Where are you taking us?" she asked. "To a place where your daughters will not be beaten for being daughters," Taza said simply. The words caught her off guard. No one had ever spoken of her girls in any way but pity or disapproval. "And you?" she asked quietly. "What do you want from me?" His gaze didn't waver. "Nothing you do not choose to give." That answer unsettled her more than any demand could have. In her life, everything given had been taken first, her labor, her body, her will. She wasn't sure she remembered how to choose at all. The youngest, little Luz, tugged on Maria's skirt. "Mama, I'm thirsty." Taza nodded toward a cluster of mesquite trees in the distance. There's water." When they reached it, he showed them a narrow spring bubbling from between two flat stones. The girls knelt and drank, giggling when the cool water splashed their faces. Maria cupped her hands and drank too, the taste sharp and alive on her tongue. "You know they will follow," she said after a moment, watching her daughters. "They will try," Taza replied. He crouched beside the spring, refilling a small leather water pouch. "But the land between here and them belongs to me." There was no arrogance in his voice, only certainty, like a man who had walked every ridge and canyon since childhood, who knew where the shadows fell at every hour. Maria found herself wondering about him. The town had called him a giant, and he was taller than any man she had known, his shoulders broad as a doorway. But there was something in his movements that was not brute force, more like patience, a kind of stillness that made you forget how dangerous he could be. When the girls had their fill, they moved on. The sun climbed higher, bleaching the sky, and heat rose from the ground in shimmering waves. At one point, Maria glanced back and saw nothing but empty land. No dust clouds, no riders. But the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. "You were afraid." "They will come," Taza said, not as a question. "I am afraid of what they will do if they catch us," she admitted. He shifted the staff in his hand. "Then they will not catch us." There was no promise of safety in his tone, only inevitability, as if the desert itself had sided with him. For the first time since leaving her house, Maria felt the tiniest flicker of trust. It was a fragile thing, but it was there. And as the road stretched farther into the wild, she began to realize that "you're coming with me" had not been a command at all. It had been an opening. Back in San Madrigal, the dust from Taza's departure had barely settled before Maria's husband stormed into the saloon. The air inside was thick with smoke and the stale tang of beer, but it did nothing to soften the sharp edge of his voice. "He took her," he said, loud enough for every man within earshot to turn. "That Apache walked into my house and took my wife and kids." At first, there was a beat of silence, part disbelief, part calculation. Then the murmurs began, swelling like an incoming tide. "Which one?" someone asked from the corner. "The giant," came the reply. "The one they say killed 3 cavalrymen up near Devil's Spine." "That's just talk," another said. "But I've seen him. Big as a bear." Maria's husband slammed his palm on the bar. "I don't care if he's big as the mountains. I want her back." The bartender, polishing the glass, raised an eyebrow. "And what happens when you do? You planning to beat her in front of the whole town again?" The man's jaw tightened. "She's mine. That's all anyone needs to know." Before long, 5 men had stepped forward, each with their own reasons, some for pay, some for pride, and at least one because he'd been nursing a grudge against Apaches for years. They saddled their horses, loaded rifles, and set out with the smell of whiskey still on their breath. Out in the desert, Taza knew they would come. It was the way of men like Maria's husband. When they lost something, they convinced themselves it had been stolen, never that it had left of its own will. He read the land as they traveled, his eyes moving, constantly watching for fresh hoof prints, the angle of the wind, the way the mesquite branches leaned. Every sign told him a story. He knew which arroyos would carry sound, which gullies could hide tracks, and which dry washes would leave no trace at all. Maria walked close to her daughters, her eyes flicking toward Taza from time to time. He said little, but when he did speak, it was practical. "Step where I step," he told her. "It makes one trail, not many." She obeyed, noticing how his footprints fell on patches of hard stone or in the shadows where the sand was packed tight. Even the children, once restless, began to mimic his quiet precision. By midday, the sun was a hammer overhead, beating down on their backs. Taza led them into a narrow ravine where the rock walls rose high and cool, offering shade. From there, he climbed a boulder and scanned the horizon. Far to the east, a faint smear of dust curled upward. Riders. They're coming, he said when he dropped down. Maria's stomach tightened. How many? Enough? She wanted to ask what enough meant, but the look in his eyes told her the answer wouldn't comfort her. The posse pushed hard. By late afternoon, they had found the faint trail Taza had left behind, just enough to follow if you knew what you were looking for. The husband rode at the front, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the land ahead. We can catch him before dark, one man called. Not if he knows the land, another muttered, and he does. Still. They pressed on, each mile narrowing the gap. Taza, meanwhile, led Maria and the girls through a twisting labyrinth of rock spires. The path was so narrow in places that they had to turn sideways to slip through. The girls whispered to each other about the strange shapes in the stone faces, animals, even the outline of a giant's hand reaching for the sky dot at the far end. Taza stopped and crouched beside a patch of sand. With a smooth branch, he swept away the last signs of their passing. Then he pointed to a dark slit in the rock. In there, he said. The gap opened into a small cave, cool and hidden. Inside, the air smelled faintly of earth and water. Maria guided the girls in, settling them near the back. She felt her heart pounding, not from the walk but from the knowledge that men were out there hunting them. Taza remained at the entrance, his broad frame half in shadow. They'll ride past, he said. And if they don't? She asked. His eyes met hers, steady and unblinking. Then the desert will take them. As the sun dipped low, the sound of hoofbeats echoed faintly off the rocks. Maria held her daughters close, listening to the voices outside, muted, frustrated, uncertain. Then the sound faded, swallowed by the wind. Taza stepped back into the cave, nodding once. We move at night. Maria exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. The chase wasn't over, but for now, they were still ahead. And in the quiet dark, she began to understand that every step with him was taking her deeper into a world where the rules she'd lived by no longer held. Night in the desert was never silent. It hummed. Crickets whispered in the grass tufts. Coyotes called to one another across the ridges. And somewhere in the distance, the faint trickle of water slipped over stone. Maria lay awake in the small cave where they had hidden from the posse, her daughters curled against her, their breathing soft and even. Taza sat at the entrance, the firelight from a small, smokeless flame painting the planes of his face in gold and shadow. His eyes scanned the dark, never resting for long in one place. She wondered if he ever slept. When dawn came, they began walking again. This time, they did not take the most direct path. Taza led them through winding gullies, over ridges of pale rock, across dry creek beds. At first, Maria thought he was only trying to confuse any trackers, but by the third day, she realized there was a pattern to the way he moved. Each turn, each stop, was deliberate. By mid-morning, the land began to change. The ground dipped into a hidden valley, and the air grew cooler. Juniper trees clung to the slopes, their roots finding purchase in cracks that seemed too small to hold them. Birds she didn't recognize flashed between branches. The sound of water grew louder. When they stepped out of the narrow pass, Maria stopped. Before them lay a canyon carved deep into the earth, its walls streaked red and gold. At the base ran a stream, winding through groves of cottonwood and wild grass. Small gardens dotted the banks, each one neat and green. And scattered among the trees were lodges of wood and hide, their smoke rising in thin, steady columns into the morning air. Children played near the water, their laughter carrying up the canyon walls. Women worked at grinding stones or hung bright woven blankets over low branches to dry in the sun. It was not a camp for warriors. It was a home. Taza led them down the slope. The children by the stream spotted him first, calling out his name, and voices that held no fear. Some ran to meet him, wrapping their arms around his waist. He greeted each with a hand on the head or a few quiet words before leading Maria and her daughters toward the heart of the canyon. An older woman, her hair silver and long, approached. Her eyes moved over Maria, taking in the torn hem of her dress, the bruise still faintly visible on her cheek. She spoke in Apache, and Taza answered in the same tongue. Maria couldn't understand the words, but she felt the weight of them, gentle, approving. "This is Nanton's mother," Taza said, turning to her. "She keeps the stories of this place. She will help you." Maria hesitated, unused to being addressed as someone worth helping. Nanton's mother placed a warm hand on her shoulder and nodded once. They were led to a lodge near the water's edge. Inside, Maria found blankets spread neatly over woven mats and a clay pot of water with cups beside it. Her daughters explored timidly at first, then with growing excitement touching the soft blankets, peering through the opening in the roof where the sunlight streamed down. Later, Taza returned with a basket of food: flatbread, roasted squash, and something like beans but smaller and darker. "You can stay here," he said, setting the basket down. "No one will touch you without your word. No one will touch your daughters without yours." Maria studied him. "Why?" "Because you were taken from yourself," he said. "Here you can return." His words sank into her slowly, as if her mind had to make room for them after years of hearing the opposite. Over the next days, she began to see what he meant. The women of the canyon moved freely, their voices carrying across the stream without hesitation. Men worked beside them without command or claim. Children, girls, and boys alike ran together, their laughter spilling into the air without fear of being silenced. Maria's daughters found friends quickly. Sophia learned how to weave reeds into baskets from a girl her own age. Luz spent hours playing a stone-tossing game with two younger boys. The middle three trailed after the older children, exploring the edges of the gardens. At night, when the fires burned low, Maria would watch Taza speaking quietly with the elders or mending his staff with a stone tool. He never looked at her with the hunger of a man who believed he was owed something. Instead, he looked at her as if she were already whole, even if she didn't feel that way yet. The truth of the giant was not that he was a feared warrior, though he was. It was that he was a keeper of land, of people, of the quiet spaces where the broken could learn to stand again. And for the first time in years, Maria began to believe that her daughters might grow without the weight she had carried all her life. The first sign wasn't sound. It was the birds. A flock of black-throated sparrows rose suddenly from the mesquite on the ridge, their sharp calls slicing through the morning stillness. Taza, standing by the stream, looked up at once. His eyes followed the bird's flight, and then shifted to the rim of the canyon. "They're here," he said. Maria froze where she was kneeling beside a basket of soaking reeds. Her daughters stopped playing and turned toward her, sensing the shift in the air. Around them, the women began calling children to the lodges, while several men and older boys moved to gather boughs, quivers, and spears. From the ridge above came the faint scrape of metal against rock, the sound of horses being reined in. Dust drifted over the edge, curling down like smoke. The posse had found them. Taza moved quickly, speaking to the others in Apache. Two men ran to the far end of the canyon, where a narrow gorge funneled out into the desert. A group of archers climbed to the ledges above, their bodies blending into the stone. Maria caught only fragments of his words, but she understood the intent. This was not a retreat. This was a stand. She gathered her daughters inside the lodge, but her eyes stayed on the entrance flap, watching as Taza took position at the center of the canyon floor, directly beneath the main path into the gorge. His carved staff was in one hand, a bow slung across his back, a long knife at his hip. The first rider appeared at the top of the path, a dark silhouette against the bright sky. Then another. And another. Maria's husband was among them, rifle slung over his shoulder. He leaned forward in the saddle, scanning the canyon with the eyes of a man who believed victory was already his. "Taza!" he shouted, his voice echoing. "Send her out now, and maybe I let the rest of you live." The giant Apache didn't answer. He stood still, the breeze tugging at the leather ties in his hair. The posse began to descend. It was a dangerous path, narrow, steep, with loose shale underfoot. That was the canyon's first weapon. 2 horses balked, one stumbling enough that its rider had to dismount and lead it. Halfway down, the first arrow struck Dot. It came from somewhere high on the wall, burying itself in the hat brim of the lead rider. He yelped, ducked, and lost his balance, tumbling into the man behind him. They both went down hard, sliding in a tangle of dust and curses. More arrows followed, not wild shots, but precise, each one meant to slow the descent. The riders pulled back, huddling against the wall for cover. That was when Taza moved. He strode forward into the mouth of the gorge, his voice ringing out in Apache. The words rolled like thunder, and the men on the ledges above responded, sending down a hail of stones loosened from the canyon wall. The posse scrambled, shouting, horses rearing. The confined space worked against them. There was no room to spread out, no way to circle. Maria's husband, still mounted, raised his rifle and fired. The shot cracked through the canyon, splintering a chunk of rock near Taza's shoulder, but the Apache didn't flinch. In a fluid motion, he unslung his bow, drew and loosed an arrow that whistled past the man's ear, close enough to slice the skin. The message was clear. Next one will not miss. From her lodge, Maria clutched the edge of the flap, her heart pounding. She saw her husband's face twisted now, not with confidence, but with something darker, doubt. Another volley of arrows rained down, followed by a sudden rush of figures from the shadows of the canyon walls, men and women both, moving with the land striking at the riders' exposed flanks. The posse broke. Some fled back up the path, scrambling for the safety of the ridge. Others tried to force their way deeper into the canyon, but found every turn blocked, every rise defended. The gorge became a trap, swallowing them in dust and echoing shouts. Maria saw her husband dismount, clutching his rifle as he retreated with 2 others. His eyes locked with hers for the briefest moment across the canyon floor. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but whatever words he had died in the roar of another stonefall. Minutes later, the only sound was the wind. The posse was gone, those who could still ride retreating into the open desert, their threats scattered like sand through fingers. Tazia lowered his bow, breathing steady. Around him, the defenders emerged from their cover, checking for wounds, retrieving arrows. Maria stepped from the lodge, her daughters clinging to her skirt. She looked at the man who had walked into her house days ago and simply said, "You're coming with me." Now she understood the other half of the promise, that he had also meant, "I will fight for you." The canyon returned to its quiet, but Maria knew the echo of this battle would carry far beyond its walls. By late afternoon, the canyon had returned to its strange, deceptive calm. Smoke from the cook fires drifted upward in thin threads. The stream moved over its stones as it always had, carrying light in its ripples. But Maria knew it was not the same canyon she had entered days ago. It was no longer simply a hidden place. It was a place she now belonged to. If she dared, the defenders had returned from the gorge in small groups, speaking quietly, tending to minor scrapes and twisted ankles. No one boasted, no one crowed about the victory. It was as if they all understood that what had happened was not a triumph to be celebrated, but a protection that had simply been necessary. Taza stood apart, cleaning the dust from his bow. restringing it with deliberate, careful movements. Every so often, someone would come to speak with him, and he would nod without looking up. Maria sat by the stream with her daughters. They had taken to the water without fear now, their shoes abandoned on the bank, their dresses hitched to their knees. Luz and Sophia tried to catch minnows with their hands while the younger three built a small dam of pebbles and sticks. There! Laughter cut into Maria's heart not because it hurt, but because it was a sound she had never imagined hearing so freely from them. She had not heard her husband's voice in the fight's aftermath. She didn't need to. The last look they'd shared in the gorge had been enough. He would not return for her. Not after the humiliation of retreat, not after the public failure to dominate her. The thought should have frightened her, but it didn't. As the sun dipped low, casting the canyon in warm shadow, Nanton's mother approached. She lowered herself to sit beside Maria with the slow grace of someone who had learned patience long ago. "You are thinking," the old woman said in accented Spanish. Maria nodded. "You have two paths," Nanton's mother went on, gazing toward the far end of the canyon where the gorge lay hidden. "You can go back to the world that beat you for giving life to daughters, or you can stay in the one that will guard those daughters as if they were the earth itself." Maria looked at her. "And if I stay? Then you are one of us. Number one here will ask who you were before. No one will tell your girls they are less because they are not boys." The woman's gaze was sharp now. "But if you stay, you must also protect others as we protected you today." It was not a gift. Without cost. Maria felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. Responsibility, not just safety. That night, Taza came to her lodge. He did not enter, but stood just beyond the flap, the firelight catching in the lines of his face. "You should know," he said, "that your husband may return. Men like him rarely forget their anger. But if you leave now, you give him back his power. If you stay, you take it from him forever." Maria studied him for a long moment. "And if I stay, will you always fight for me?" Taza shook his head. "No, I will fight beside you." It was a small difference in words, but it opened something inside her. No one had ever spoken to her as if she had the right and the ability to stand beside them as an equal. She lay awake long after her daughters slept, listening to the sounds of the canyon, the low murmur of water, the faint chorus of night. Insects, the occasional bark of a coyote on the rim. She thought of the life behind her. A kitchen where her hands were never still, but her voice was silent. A bed where her body was taken, but her spirit ignored. A yard where her daughters were taught to keep their eyes low. Then she thought of the life ahead, if she dared step into it. Days of work, yes, but with laughter in it. Nights of danger, perhaps, but not without allies. A place where her daughters could learn the names of birds and stars instead of the weight of shame. By the time the eastern sky began to pale, her choice was made. At dawn, she led her daughters to the council fire. The people of the canyon gathered in a loose circle, the morning light spilling over the rim. Taza stood opposite her, his eyes unreadable. Maria took a breath and let it out slowly. "We will stay," she said in Spanish, then repeated it in the halting Apache words she had learned from the children over the past days. "We will stay, and we will stand with you." A murmur moved through the crowd, not surprise, but acceptance. Taza gave a single nod. "Then you are home." For the first time in years, Maria felt the truth of it. Seasons changed in the canyon. The brittle gold of autumn gave way to the silver chill of winter, then to the green flush that came after the spring rains. Maria stayed. In those first months, she worked as if making up for years stolen from her. She learned the hidden paths through the rocks, the places where the stream ran deepest, the way to weave baskets tight enough to hold water. She learned words in Apache, not as a guest might, but as someone planting herself in the soil of a new life. Her daughters thrived. Luz, the eldest, who had once kept her voice low, now spoke with the confidence of someone who knew she would be heard. Sophia learned to ride with a bareback grip that kept her steady even on the steep canyon trails. The younger three, Isabel, Anna, and Rosa, roamed in a little pack, gathering cactus fruit, bringing back wildflowers, their laughter scattering like seeds across the stone. Maria's hands grew stronger. So did her back. But more than that, her spirit began to take shape again, not the bowed shape it had been in the town, but something upright and rooted. Tiazier kept his word. He fought beside her, not for her. In disputes at the council fire, he would speak, then look to her, waiting for her thoughts before any decision was made. One evening in early summer, the people gathered to decide whether to send scouts toward a new mining camp that had appeared too close to the canyon rim. Maria spoke up. "They will come looking for water," she said. "And when they do, they will find this place. We must be ready before they arrive, not after." Her words were met with quiet nods. When Taza agreed with her, it was not the agreement of a leader granting permission. It was the agreement of a leader standing alongside another. That night, Nanton's mother came to sit beside her again, just as she had months earlier. "You speak now like someone who has always been here," the old woman said. "That is when you know you are part of a people, when you cannot remember the day you were apart from them." Maria still thought, at times, of the world she had left. Rumors reached the canyon of her husband's growing bitterness, of his threats to finish what he started. But the thought no longer hollowed her out. She knew now that if he came, the canyon would not meet him with silence or submission. And neither would she. Years passed. The girls grew taller, surer of themselves. Luz became a tracker, able to follow a bent blade of grass for miles. Sophia could handle a bow as well as anyone in the canyon. Isabel began carving wood into toys and tools, while Aina learned the medicinal uses of every plant within a day's walk. Rosa, still the youngest, had a mind for stories, gathering them from the elders and carrying them like treasures. Maria found her own place in the life of the canyon as a teacher of the younger children, showing them how to work the reeds into baskets, how to plant beans in hidden pockets of soil, how to make a fire even in wind. She taught them Spanish songs, and in return, they taught her songs in Apache. On the 5th anniversary of her arrival, the people held a feast. It was not for her alone such honors were rare, but for the health of the canyon itself. Still, as they passed food and sang around the fire, Maria felt the weight of her journey settle into something whole. She remembered the day she had been lifted from the dust, bruised and ashamed, hearing the words, "You're coming with me." At the time, she had thought they meant escape. She now understood they had also meant transformation. Much later, when the fire burned low and the children slept, she stood at the mouth of the gorge, looking out over the starlit desert. Taza came to stand beside her, saying nothing for a long while. "You were afraid once," he said at last. "Yes," she answered. "You are not now." "No," she smiled faintly. "I have been given something that cannot be taken." "What is that?" "A life where my daughters will never bow their heads to anyone." Taza nodded. "Then the canyon has done its work." Maria stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had found the only place where she could truly be. And in the years to come, when travelers spoke in whispers of the hidden canyon protected by the giant Apache and the woman who walked beside him, they always spoke of the 5 daughters wild as the wind, free as the hawks, and raised in a place where no child was ever born a burden.